Hi everyone, and welcome to this Fantasy Art Friday video. In this video I'm going to be working on a drawing of a rock dragon, and I always have so much fun with these dragon drawings. I recently worked on the earth dragon, giving it a wood texture with ivy and moss and flowers. So for a rock dragon, I wanted to imagine that this dragon would live up in the mountains, and when it's resting, when it's lying down and it's got its eyes closed, it just looks like another rock formation. So it actually took me quite a while to get the sketch completed, thinking about the way this dragon would blend in with its environment. And then once I was finally happy with how the sketch was looking, I then moved on to working on the pen outlines, using mainly a Pigma Micron 05, and then for any of the finer lines that I needed for some of the vines hanging from its face and some of the grass patches on top of the rock formations, I was using a Copic Multiliner SP 0.03mm. Just changing up the line weight and adding the thicker lines to the areas that would need more shading later on. And I was also using these pens to add some fine lines along the edges of the rocks to help give a head start on that rock texture. I added rock plating along its front, and then on its back, to act as more armour, I added a bunch of different cliff faces that would act as a way of protecting it, but would also act as another way for it to blend in with its environment. And just as I was finishing the outlines, I decided to add a few small trees to really add a sense of scale to how massive this dragon could be. Then, once the outlines were completed, I moved on to working on the colouring, and for the colouring of this drawing I used Copic Markers, starting off by working on the colouring of the dragon's face. For the majority of the colouring of this drawing I was using the cool grey markers, ranging between cool grey 1, 3, 5 and 7, using the 1, 3 and 5 to add the base layers of shading to begin with, and adding the lightest shading towards the front of the dragon's face. And just building up the layers of shading, adding streaks of shading to show that rock texture. And then once I was happy with how that was looking, I then started adding the darkest shading with the cool grey 7. And I found that once I started placing that darkest shading, it really started to add depth to the drawing, and it really helps to add more shape to the rocks overall. For the colouring of the moss, I used a moss and a verdigris marker. After that, for the colouring of the dragon's eye, I added a base layer of colour with a pale heath marker, and then used a cerise to add that bright colouring to its pupil. And finally started adding some highlights to the eye and to the moss and some of those areas with a Uni-Ball Signo Broad white ink pen. I also started using a white Prismacolor pencil to start outlining some of the individual rocks as a way to help show up their shape amongst all of the dark shading I'd added. For the large rock formations on the back of the dragon's head, I used the same rock texture process with the cool grey markers, and then used a cool grey 3 to add the smooth shading on top. To add the grass, I used the moss and the verdigris markers again, and then started adding the highlights around these areas with the Uni-Ball highlighter pen and the white Prismacolor pencil. After that, I worked on the colouring of the little trees standing on top of the rock formations. For the tree trunks, I used a mixture of champagne and maroon markers, and then for the colouring of the leaves, I used a verdigris marker. And also to help place these trees on top of the rock formations, I added some shading underneath them with the cool grey 3 and 5. Moving on to the colouring of the dragon's neck, I used a similar rock process for the rock plating on the front, but I also added some stains and some texturing within that, adding some greens and some browns with moss and champagne markers, just trying to add some interesting colours within this area. After that, for the colouring of the rock formations on the back of the dragon's neck, I used a similar process that I did for the rock formations on the top of its head. Adding all of the base layers the same way as I did before, but then I started adding some darker shading over the top of that, even adding in some black Copic marker, and then blending that outwards and smoothing the gradients with the cool grey 7 and cool grey 5, even adding some darker shading over the top of the grass with the cool grey 5 as well. And just generally making this area much darker and adding much more depth to it as a way of hopefully making the highlighted areas on the front of the dragon's face stand out that much more. Once I was happy with how the dragon was looking, it was time to work on the final part of the drawing, and that was the background within the comic panel that I'd added. For this, I wanted to add some warm tones. I wanted to add warm pink tones that would really complement the greens that I added to the dragon. So I started by using a pale heath marker to add some colouring to the sky, and added a couple of layers, adding in a layer of cloud. Underneath that, I added a mountain, and then further in front of that, I added some rock formations that kind of blend in with the rock formations on the dragon's head. So maybe there are some more dragons in this area. So I added the darker shading to the background with a pale grape marker, and then blended upwards with a pale heath, just to just keep that like faded in the background, and so it didn't take away from the dragon. After that, to add the final parts of this drawing, I added some highlights going all the way around the dragon, and then also added some particle effects with the highlighter pen and a pure pink marker. And after that, this drawing was completed. It was super fun to work on this one, and I loved kind of thinking about where it would be living and why it would have these rock formations on its back, and the way it would kind of blend into its environment. Please let me know what you think of this drawing in the comments below, and if you have any suggestions for future fantasy art or fan art, any suggestions really help me out, and they do really help the channel. If you want to see more videos like this, then make sure you're subscribed, and any likes or shares on this video are hugely appreciated, and it really does mean a lot to me. If you want to follow my progress photos and keep up to date with everything I'm working on, then be sure to check out the links in the description box below to check out my Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And once again, thank you so much for the support on this channel, and thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're having an amazing day, and I'll see you all soon.